The notification hit my phone while I was standing in the grocery store comparing prices like I always did. Calculator open in my head, wondering which brand would stretch the week a little further. I almost ignored it. I usually did. But this one made my stomach tighten before I even unlocked the screen. $43,200. For a split second, my mind scrambled for innocent explanations. A system error. Fraud. A mistake I could fix with one calm phone call. Then I saw the merchant name. Then the note under the charge. BMW dealership. My hands went cold. I pushed my cart out of the line and walked straight to the parking lot, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called my parents immediately. My dad answered on the second ring, his voice upbeat, almost cheerful. Before I could even finish asking what had happened, my mom laughed in the background. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't apologetic. It was light, amused, almost bored. "Jessica needs a better car to get around than you," she said like she was explaining something obvious to a child. I remember gripping my phone so tightly my fingers went numb. Not because of the money. I could recover from that eventually. What froze me was the certainty in her voice. The assumption. The way she said it, as if my credit card had always belonged to them, as if my life had always been an extension of theirs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask why they hadn't told me first. I just said, "It's okay. I understand." There was a pause on the line, then relief. My dad exhaled. My mom hummed, satisfied. They thought the moment had passed. They had no idea that was the moment everything changed. I'm in my early 30s, and I've always been the careful one in my family. The one who planned, the one who saved. I work a steady job, pay my bills on time, and think twice before spending money on myself. I don't live extravagantly. I don't take luxury trips. I don't buy brand new cars. I was never raised to. My younger sister Jessica is different. She's spontaneous, charming, and always seems to land on her feet no matter what decisions she makes. Where I learned to brace for consequences, she learned to expect rescue. And somehow that rescue almost always came from me. The BMW wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time the number was too large to pretend it didn't matter. After the call ended, I sat in my car for a long time without turning the engine on. The parking lot buzzed around me, carts rattling doors, slamming people living their normal lives. I stared at my phone, half expecting another call, an explanation, an apology. None came. Instead, a text popped up from my mom a few minutes later. A picture of a glossy black BMW parked in a dealership showroom. Jessica stood next to it, smiling, wide keys in her hand, like she'd won something. So excited for her, the message read. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and finally drove home. My parents live in a house I own. I bought it years ago, back when they told me they just needed a place to stay temporarily. A few months, maybe a year, until things stabilized. That was the word they used. Temporary. They said it a lot. At the time, it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like an obligation. They were my parents. Of course I helped. I didn't think about what it would cost me long term. I didn't think about boundaries or exit plans. I just signed the paperwork, handed over the keys, and told myself I was doing the right thing. Sitting alone that afternoon, the quiet felt heavier than any argument we could have had. I replayed my mom's words over and over in my head. "Jessica needs a better car than you. Not we're sorry. Not we'll pay you back. Just a ranking." A reminder of where I stood. I thought about all the times I'd stayed silent before. All the moments I'd swallowed discomfort because speaking up felt selfish. I'd always believed that if I stayed calm, stayed reasonable, stayed understanding, things would eventually even out. But as the sun dipped lower outside my window, something settled inside me with an unexpected clarity. This wasn't about the car. It wasn't even about the money. It was about a role I'd been playing my entire life. That night, my dad called again, casually, like nothing had happened. He talked about insurance paperwork for the car, about how busy the dealership had been, about how happy Jessica was. I listened. I responded politely. I didn't mention the charge. I didn't mention my card. When he asked if everything was okay, I said yes. And I meant something very different than he thought. If you've ever been the one your family relies on, without asking, the one expected to absorb every inconvenience quietly, you might recognize that moment. The moment when you stop feeling angry and start feeling clear. That's the moment I want you to stay with me through. Because what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve shouting or ultimatums. It involved paperwork timing and a decision I'd been avoiding for years. If this story feels familiar so far, stay with me. And if you want to hear how I finally stopped being the safety net without tearing myself apart in the process, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. I promise this is only the beginning. After the call ended, the silence in my apartment felt louder than any argument we could have had. I kept hearing my mother's voice in my head, the way she'd laughed when she said Jessica needed a better car than me, as if it were a harmless observation instead of a line drawn clean across our lives. I made dinner that night out of habit more than hunger. Chopped vegetables, boiled pasta went through the motions, like my body knew what to do even if my mind didn't. I replayed the conversation while the water simmered, searching for the moment I might have misunderstood something. I didn't find one. The words were clear. They always were. At some point, standing there alone, I had a thought that stopped me mid-movement. They've been saying versions of this my entire life. Not always with cars or money. Sometimes it was smaller, quieter. But the message was always the same. Jessica was the one who needed more. My sister had always been described as free-spirited. That was the word my parents used when she made impulsive choices or walked away from responsibilities. When I was careful, they called me practical. When she was careless, they called her brave. It wasn't malicious, not on the surface. It was framed as personality. But over time, personality turned into permission. Jessica never had to plan the way I did. If she ran out of money, someone would help. If she quit a job, there was always an explanation. If she made a mistake, it was just part of her journey. My journey, on the other hand, seemed to revolve around making sure there was always something left to give. The first memory that came back to me that night was small, almost insignificant on its own. I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11, standing in the kitchen holding a piece of paper with my grades on it. I'd worked hard for them, stayed up late studying while Jessica watched television in the next room. I remember waiting for the right moment to show my parents rehearsing what I'd say. My mom glanced at the paper, smiled politely, and said, "That's nice, honey." Then she turned back to Jessica, who was complaining about a dance rehearsal she didn't want to attend anymore. The conversation shifted instantly. I stood there for a few seconds longer, then folded the paper and put it away. I learned something that day, even if I couldn't have put it into words back then. Achievement didn't earn attention. Need did. As we got older, that lesson only deepened. In high school, I worked after classes to save money, telling myself it would help later. My parents praised my independence, but they also leaned on it. When Jessica wanted something extra, there was always a reason she couldn't work right now. When I wanted something, I was reminded how capable I was of earning it myself. In college, I took on loans and part-time jobs without complaint. Jessica went somewhere more expensive because she needed the experience. My parents talked about fairness like it was a flexible concept, something that bent toward whoever seemed most vulnerable in the moment. And vulnerability in our family was something Jessica wore easily. I don't think my parents ever sat down and decided to treat us differently. I think they responded to whoever made them feel needed. And Jessica was very good at that. I was good at making things easier. By the time we were adults, the pattern felt so normal I barely questioned it. When my parents had financial trouble years ago, they called me first. Not because I had the most money, but because I had the most stability. When they needed a place to stay, they didn't ask if it was okay. They told me it would be temporary, and I said yes before thinking about what that meant. I was proud of myself for being able to help. That pride kept me quiet longer than it should have. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, fork untouched beside my plate, I realized how predictable the BMW situation really was. Of course they'd use my card. Of course they wouldn't ask. Of course they'd justify it by comparing Jessica to me. In their eyes, I didn't need anything. I was fine. I always had been. My phone buzzed again around 9 that evening. This time, it was Jessica. A picture popped up on my screen, the inside of the BMW lit softly dashboard, glowing, her hand on the steering wheel. "Can you believe this car?" she texted. "I feel like a new person." I stared at the message longer than I meant to. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of where the money came from, just excitement floating freely, untethered from consequences. I typed out a response, then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. In the end, I didn't reply at all. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let myself think about something I'd avoided for years. Not what they owed me, but what I'd been giving up. I'd told myself for a long time that being the reliable one was a strength, that keeping the peace mattered more than keeping score. But that night, with the quiet pressing in around me, I wondered when peace had started costing me so much. I thought about the house. Not in detail, not yet. Just the fact of it. How often my parents referred to it as home. How rarely they mentioned my name when they did. The thought made my chest tighten, not with anger but with recognition. They didn't see me as the owner. They saw me as the provider. That distinction had never felt so clear. For the first time, I didn't rush to fix the situation. I didn't call my parents back to negotiate. I didn't ask Jessica to be considerate. I didn't explain how much the charge meant to me or how long it would take to recover from it. I sat with the discomfort and let it exist without smoothing it over. There was a part of me that felt guilty even thinking this way. A familiar voice in my head whispered that I was being dramatic, that families help each other, that money shouldn't matter so much. I'd heard those words my whole life. I'd repeated them to myself whenever something felt unfair. But another voice, quieter and steadier, had started to speak up. It reminded me of all the times I'd been told I was strong enough to handle it. All the times my needs had been invisible because I didn't make them loud. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I hadn't formed a plan. I hadn't made any decisions beyond one simple thing. I wasn't going to keep pretending this was normal. As I finally cleared the table and washed the dishes, the realization settled in slowly, like something heavy finding its place. The BMW wasn't the problem. It was just the moment that forced me to look back and see the pattern clearly for the first time. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. I went to bed later than usual that night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the familiar hum of the city outside my window. My phone sat on the nightstand, silent for once. No calls, no explanations, no emergencies. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next one. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew one thing with a certainty that surprised me. I wasn't going to carry this alone anymore. The next morning I woke up before my alarm, the kind of early, restless waking that usually followed a bad dream. Except this time, there hadn't been a dream. Just a steady awareness sitting in my chest, heavy but clear. My phone was quiet. No missed calls, no follow-up texts explaining the charge or promising to handle it later. That silence should have made me anxious. It always had before. Instead, it felt strangely confirming. I went through my routine on autopilot. Showered, dressed, poured coffee I barely tasted. While I stood at the kitchen counter staring out the window, a thought surfaced that stopped me mid-sip. They weren't waiting for my answer. They were waiting for my compliance. Once I saw it that way, the past rearranged itself in my mind with uncomfortable precision. All those moments I'd mistaken for discussions had never really been negotiations. They were announcements. Decisions made without me, then softened with explanations afterward, as if the explanation itself was the courtesy. I checked my credit card app again, even though I already knew what I'd see. the charge was still there. Pending, but real. $43,200 sitting on my account like a quiet dare. On my way to work, my dad called. I let it ring twice before answering, just long enough to remind myself I didn't owe anyone immediate access to me anymore. Morning, he said, cheerful again like yesterday hadn't happened. Your mom wanted me to check if you'd gotten the email from the dealership. They sent over some warranty info. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly on brand. The assumption that I'd want to stay involved, that I'd help manage the details, that I'd absorb the responsibility along with the cost. I saw it, I said evenly. Great, he replied. We'll sort through it later. Jessica's heading out to show the car to a friend today. She's over the moon. I waited for the part where he acknowledged what they'd done, the apology that never came. When it didn't, something inside me settled further. We talked for another minute about nothing important. Then he hung up satisfied. At work, I found it harder than usual to concentrate. Numbers blurred together on my screen as my mind kept circling back to one question I'd never asked myself before. What happens if I don't step in? The idea felt almost taboo. In my family, stepping in was my role. I smoothed things over. I made things work. I absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. That pattern had been so consistent for so long that imagining my absence from it felt destabilizing. During lunch, I sat alone at my desk instead of joining my coworkers in the break room. I needed the quiet. I needed to think without interruption. I opened a blank document on my computer and stared at it for a long moment before typing a single sentence. What do I actually owe them? I didn't answer it right away. I let the question sit there stark and uncomfortable. My parents had raised me. That was true. They'd put a roof over my head, food on the tablecloths on my back. Those facts had been used like currency for as long as I could remember, reminders brought up whenever I hesitated or pushed back. But they'd also leaned on me in ways they never leaned on Jessica, expected me to adapt to compromise to carry weight quietly. I'd never signed up for that, not consciously. It had been assigned to me early, reinforced gently, then enforced through guilt. I closed the document without typing anything else. Some questions didn't need immediate answers. Some just needed to be asked out loud, even if only to yourself. That afternoon, my mom texted, "Just checking in. Hope you're not still upset. We're family. You know how things are." I stared at the message, noticing how carefully it was worded. No mention of the charge. No acknowledgement of my feelings beyond a vague reference to being upset. The phrase, "you know how things are," landed with a dull thud. Yes, I did know. I typed back a short reply. I'm fine. And I was. Or at least I wasn't spiraling the way I used to. There was a distance growing between what they expected and what I felt responsible for, and that distance was doing something unexpected. It was giving me room to breathe. That evening I went for a walk after dinner, something I rarely made time for. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet, porch lights flickering on as the sun dipped lower. As I walked, I thought about how many times I'd rushed to respond in the past, afraid that delay would escalate things. Now delay felt like a choice. I realized something else too, something that surprised me. They weren't worried. Not really. My silence hadn't made them anxious. It hadn't prompted concern or reflection. It had made them comfortable. They assumed I'd absorbed the shock and moved on like I always did. In their minds, the issue was resolved the moment I said I understood. That realization stung more than the charge itself. When I got home, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the couch without turning on the TV. I let the quiet stretch out around me. For the first time, I noticed how often my thoughts used to revolve around anticipating my family's needs, planning for their next problem, bracing for the next call. Tonight, there was none of that. Instead, my mind drifted toward something I'd been avoiding for years, the cost of always being available. I thought about my savings, the trips I'd postponed, the risks I'd never taken because stability mattered too much. I thought about how often I'd chosen practicality over desire, responsibility over rest. I'd told myself it was just who I was, that some people were givers and some were takers, and that balance somehow made things work. But balance implied reciprocity, and there had never been much of that. Later that night, Jessica posted a photo on social media. The BMW parked under bright lights, her leaning against it with a caption full of excitement and emojis. Friends commented congratulating her, celebrating her upgrade. No one asked how she'd paid for it. I didn't comment. I didn't like the post. I didn't feel the urge to explain anything to anyone. Instead, I turned off my phone and sat with the feeling that had been building all day. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even resentment. It was clarity. I saw with startling sharpness how predictable I'd been, how my reactions had kept the system running smoothly, how my explanations had given everyone permission to keep doing what they were doing. And I saw just as clearly what my silence was doing now. It wasn't fixing anything. It wasn't soothing anyone. It wasn't earning approval. It was creating space. I didn't know yet what I'd do with that space. I hadn't reached the point of action. But for the first time, I wasn't trying to fill it immediately. I went to bed that night with my phone on the dresser instead of the nightstand, a small, deliberate change. As I turned off the light, one thought settled in with quiet certainty. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. They were wrong. The calm that followed surprised me more than the shock had. I kept waiting for my chest to tighten, for my thoughts to start racing, for that familiar urge to fix things before they spun out of control. It didn't come. Instead, there was a strange stillness, like the air after a storm that never fully arrived. I went through my days quietly answering emails, showing up to work, smiling when required. No one there knew what had happened, and I didn't offer it up. In the past, I would have needed to talk it through to hear myself explain why it wasn't really that bad, why I'd figure it out like I always did. This time, I kept it to myself. My parents took my silence as a sign of resolution. That became clear quickly. My mom called 2 days later, her tone light, almost cheerful. She asked if I'd seen the photos she'd sent of the BMW in daylight, how the paint looked even better outside the showroom. She talked about Jessica's plans, about errands she could finally run without worrying about her old car breaking down. Not once did she ask how I was doing. "Everything okay?" she asked near the end of the call, not waiting for an answer before adding, "I knew you'd understand. You always do." I said yes, because technically, I did understand. I understood exactly how they saw me. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and let that sentence settle. You always do. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't appreciation. It was expectation delivered casually like a law of nature. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. Not about the charge. About logistics. Insurance forms. Whether I thought Jessica should get seat covers. My dad asked if I knew a good mechanic for regular maintenance, like I'd be part of the long-term plan for this car I'd never been consulted about. I answered when I felt like it. Briefly, politely. I didn't offer opinions or advice. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I kept my responses neutral, non-committal. It wasn't intentional at first. It just felt right. And something interesting happened. They relaxed. The tension I'd expected never materialized on their end. Instead, they seemed relieved, even reassured. My lack of resistance had lowered their guard completely. In their minds, the issue had been smoothed over, folded neatly into the past, like so many others before it. Watching that unfold was unsettling. It forced me to confront something I'd avoided for a long time. My reactions had always mattered more than the actions that caused them. As long as I didn't push back, nothing was wrong. I thought back to other moments like this. Times when something crossed a line and I felt that internal tug-of-war between discomfort and duty. Each time I'd chosen peace over confrontation, telling myself it was maturity. That letting things go made me the bigger person. But sitting there reading another casual text about Jessica's new sound system, I saw the pattern for what it was. My silence had never been about peace. It had been about compliance. This time, though, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy with resentment or fear. It wasn't me swallowing words I wanted to scream. It was clean, deliberate, almost protective. I wasn't ignoring them to punish them. I just wasn't rushing to fill the space anymore. One evening after a long day, I found myself staring at the wall across from my couch, noticing details I'd overlooked before. A faint scuff near the baseboard, the way the light shifted across the room as the sun went down. Ordinary things, but there was a clarity to them, a presence I hadn't felt in a while. I realized how much of my mental energy had always been spent elsewhere, anticipating calls, preparing explanations, managing reactions that weren't mine to manage. Now, without that constant pull, I had room to notice my own life again. That was when the thought came, uninvited but undeniable. This is the window. Not dramatic, not urgent, just obvious. My family was distracted, focused on the car, on Jessica's excitement, on the ease of assuming everything would continue as it always had. No one was watching me closely. No one was checking in, really checking in. The absence that used to feel like neglect now felt like freedom. For a brief moment, guilt flickered. It always did. The reflex was deeply ingrained. I imagined their faces if they knew what I was thinking, the disappointment, the accusations that would follow. I imagined my mom's voice sharp with disbelief, my dad's wounded and confused. Then I asked myself a question I'd never dared to before. What am I actually responsible for here? The answer didn't come from anger. It came from exhaustion. I was responsible for myself, for my stability, for the life I'd built carefully, piece by piece, often at the expense of my own comfort. I wasn't responsible for cushioning every choice someone else made, especially when those choices were made without me. That distinction felt radical and grounding all at once. I didn't announce any decision. I didn't make vows or promises to myself. I didn't even articulate a plan. I just stopped doing one thing. I stopped being available by default. When my dad called later that week, I let it go to voicemail. Not out of spite. I was in the middle of making dinner, enjoying the simple act of it without distraction. I listened to the message afterward. He wanted to ask something about the house, some minor repair they'd noticed. I didn't call back right away. That pause felt powerful in a way I wasn't used to. Not aggressive, not confrontational. Just mine. As the days passed, the family chatter continued, but it flowed around me instead of through me. Group messages buzzed with updates I skimmed without responding. Photos of the BMW appeared from different angles, each one reinforcing the same unspoken assumption. That I was fine. That everything was settled. They were wrong. But they didn't need to know that yet. One night lying in bed, I thought about how often I'd equated silence with weakness. How I'd believed that not speaking up meant losing ground. But now in this quiet space, I saw something else entirely. Silence could be strategy. It allowed people to reveal their expectations. It showed me exactly how they interpreted my absence. And most importantly, it gave me time. Time to think without interference. Time to decide without pressure. While they enjoyed the new car they thought I'd paid for and forgotten about, I finally had room to think. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare me. I didn't wake up that morning with a plan. I woke up with a need for certainty. For days, I'd been sitting with the same quiet awareness, letting it settle instead of pushing it away. The BMW charge was still there, unchanged, like a line drawn in ink across my account. My family continued as if nothing had happened. And I continued not reacting. But there was a difference between not reacting and not knowing. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, laptop closed in front of me, hands wrapped around the mug as the steam rose. I wasn't angry. I wasn't panicked. I just knew that if I was going to move forward in any direction, I needed facts. Not feelings, not assumptions, facts. So I opened the laptop. I didn't start with dramatic searches or impulsive messages. I went straight to the folder I hadn't opened in a long time. The one labeled with my last name and the address of the house. It sat buried in my files like something I'd intentionally avoided, not because it was painful, but because it represented responsibility I'd been carrying without question. The deed was there exactly as I remembered. My name. Only my name. No asterisks. No fine print tying me to anyone else. I stared at it longer than necessary, letting that reality sink in. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't misremembered. I was the sole owner. Next came the mortgage statements. Every monthly payment, every confirmation email, every automatic withdrawal. My bank account, my credit, my signature. Page after page of proof that what I'd been doing all these years wasn't shared responsibility. It was quiet ownership paired with loud expectation. I scrolled through property tax records, insurance documents, utility bills. Everything pointed back to me like a trail I'd been following without looking down. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Knowing I could do something wasn't the same as deciding I should. But there was something sobering about removing doubt from the equation. For years, part of me had softened my resentment by telling myself the situation was complicated. That maybe I didn't fully understand the legal or financial implications. That maybe on some level the house belonged to all of us. It didn't. And that clarity didn't feel empowering the way I might have expected. It felt heavy, like a responsibility I'd finally acknowledged instead of carrying blindly. As I sat there, another realization crept in. Even now, after everything I was still paying for that house, mortgage, taxes, insurance, maintenance, all of it continued to come out of my account each month without question. My parents lived there comfortably making decisions about the space, the repairs, the routines, and I covered the cost from a distance, rarely setting foot inside. It wasn't generosity anymore. It was habit. I closed the documents and stared at my reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. For a moment, the old fears surfaced, familiar and persistent. What would they say if I changed things? How would they frame it? Ungrateful. Selfish. Cold. I'd worn those labels before briefly whenever I'd hesitated. The difference now was that the labels didn't carry the same weight. I thought about the BMW again. About how casually my mom had laughed. About how easily my dad had folded the charge into the flow of everyday logistics. About how Jessica hadn't even considered the source of the money before enjoying the result. That wasn't confusion, it was entitlement. And entitlement only survives when someone keeps feeding it. I stood up and paced the apartment, the floor cool under my feet. My thoughts moved slowly, deliberately. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't imagining confrontations or dramatic reveals. I was asking myself one simple question. Why am I still carrying this? Not why did they do it? Not how could they? Those questions had answers I already knew. The real question was why I'd been absorbing the impact for so long. I thought about the years ahead, the way time had been slipping by quietly while I stayed in the same role, the reliable one, the fallback, the solution. I imagined continuing like this indefinitely, my finances tied up, my autonomy, compromised, my decisions filtered through what would cause the least disruption. The image felt suffocating. My phone buzzed on the counter, a message from my mom, just a reminder to check the mailbox at the house later in the week. Something important might be arriving. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I went back to the table and opened a new document. Not a letter, not a message, just a blank page. I didn't title it. I didn't outline anything. I simply wrote one sentence. I am allowed to change my mind. I stared at it, letting the words settle. They felt almost rebellious, like something I'd never been given permission to believe before. I wasn't obligated to maintain a situation that no longer made sense. I wasn't required to continue subsidizing choices I hadn't agreed to, and I wasn't cruel for recognizing that. Still, the fear lingered. Not fear of what I might do, but fear of the aftermath. The emotional fallout. the disappointment, the way my parents might look at me differently. Then another thought surfaced, quieter but steadier. They already don't see me. They saw what I provided, what I smoothed over, what I made possible. But they didn't see the cost of it, and they hadn't asked. I closed the document and shut the laptop, not because I'd reached a conclusion, but because something inside me had shifted. The uncertainty that had kept me frozen for years had thinned. In its place was a clearer understanding of the choice in front of me. Doing nothing was still a choice, and it was the one I'd been making for a very long time. That evening I didn't call anyone. I didn't bring up the charge. I didn't confront or explain. I let the day end the way it began, quietly, deliberately. Before bed, I opened my banking app one last time. The charge was still there, real, unresolved. I turned off the screen and placed the phone on my dresser. Once I knew the truth, pretending I didn't have a choice felt like lying to myself. And I was done doing that. I didn't tell anyone what I was about to do, not because it was secret, but because it was mine. The morning felt ordinary in a way that almost made me second-guess myself. Sunlight through the blinds, coffee brewing. The world continuing as if nothing significant was about to shift beneath it. That normalcy steadied me. If I'd been emotional, if I'd been shaking or pacing, I might have stopped myself. Instead, I felt grounded, finished waiting. I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, scrolling through listings and reviews, reading profiles carefully. I wasn't looking for someone who knew my family or my neighborhood. I wanted professionalism, distance. Someone who would treat the situation like what it was, a transaction. When I finally tapped the number, I didn't rehearse what I'd say. I let the call ring, listening to it connect, my pulse steady. "Hello," a woman answered, calm and confident. She introduced herself with her first name, asked how she could help. "I have a house I want to sell," I said. The words sounded heavier than I expected, but not frightening. "I'm the sole owner. It's currently occupied." There was no pause. No judgment. Just a question. "Are the occupants tenants?" "They're family," I said. "They live there rent-free." "Okay," she replied evenly. "And you want to sell the property?" "Yes." Saying it out loud changed something. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. She asked a few more questions, all practical. Address, condition, timeline. I answered honestly, without embellishment. I didn't explain why. I didn't justify myself. She didn't ask. "We can move quickly," she said after a moment. "Depending on the market, there may be strong interest. I'd like to see the property in person if that works for you." "It does," I said, surprising myself with how easy it felt. We set a time, 2 days later. When the call ended, I set my phone down and sat there, hands folded, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. There was no rush of adrenaline, no surge of triumph, just a sense of finality, like stepping onto a path you know leads forward even if you can't see the end yet. I didn't text my parents. I didn't give anyone a heads up. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I wasn't announcing it. For the first time, I wasn't over-explaining a choice that only required my consent. Later that afternoon, my mom called. I watched the phone ring from across the room while I folded laundry. For years, I would have answered immediately, afraid of what ignoring it might imply. This time, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was light, almost casual. She wanted to ask if I could look into a minor repair at the house, something about a faucet dripping. She added no rush, as if the words erased the expectation. I didn't call back right away. The space that followed felt unfamiliar, but steady. I noticed how often my day used to revolve around responding, adjusting, fixing. Without that constant interruption, time stretched differently. I finished folding the laundry, I made dinner, I went for a walk. That evening, a group message popped up from my family. Photos of Jessica beside the BMW, again this time parked outside my parents' house. Comments followed. Hearts, jokes, plans for a weekend drive. I read it without reacting. My silence wasn't loud enough to register. They were too focused on enjoying what they believed was settled. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how many decisions in my life had been shaped by fear of reaction, fear of disappointment, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as difficult. This didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like alignment. 2 days later, I drove to the house earlier than scheduled. I wanted to arrive first to be there without commentary, without context. My parents weren't home yet. Jessica's BMW wasn't in the driveway. The house sat quiet sunlight hitting the windows the same way it always had. I unlocked the door with my key and stepped inside. The realtor arrived on time. She introduced herself politely, shook my hand, and began walking through the space with a professional eye. She pointed out features, noted updates, asked neutral questions about maintenance and utilities. I followed along, answering when needed, staying present without drifting into memory. Seeing the house through her perspective was strangely grounding. It wasn't a symbol or a sacrifice. It was a property, a well-kept one. "This place has good bones," she said at one point, standing in the living room. "You've taken care of it." I nodded. I had, even from a distance. When my parents returned midway through the walkthrough, they looked surprised but not concerned. My mom asked if something was wrong with the house. I told her I was just having someone take a look. She didn't question it further. Why would she? I'd always handled things. The realtor didn't linger. She thanked me, explained next steps, and said she'd be in touch soon. When she left, my parents went back to their routines, already distracted by something else. They never asked why. That was when it truly settled in. How much they trusted my silence, how completely they assumed I'd continue to hold everything steady. Back at my apartment, my phone rang again. This time it was the realtor following up, confirming market interest, explaining timelines. She spoke calmly, confidently, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Because to her it was. After we hung up, I sat down on the couch and let myself feel the weight of what I'd started. It wasn't dread. It wasn't excitement. It was acceptance. Something irreversible had begun. I wasn't hiding anything. I wasn't plotting in the dark. I had simply stopped announcing myself in a system that relied on my predictability. While my family enjoyed the new car they believed I'd quietly absorbed and moved past, the ground beneath them had already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. I walked into the house that afternoon without the familiar knot in my stomach, and that was how I knew something had changed. For years, stepping through that front door had felt like crossing into a version of my life that no longer belonged to me. I'd move quietly, careful not to disrupt routines that weren't mine, smiling through conversations that made me feel like a guest in a place I paid for. This time, I paused just inside the entryway and let myself look around without apologizing for being there. For the first time, I saw the house clearly. The realtor arrived a few minutes later, professional and unhurried. She greeted me warmly, clipboard in hand, and began the walkthrough with the calm confidence of someone who'd seen hundreds of homes. As she moved from room to room, she spoke in neutral terms, noting square footage, natural light, storage space. Her voice stripped the rooms of their emotional weight, and I felt something loosen in my chest. "This is a strong property," she said, standing by the window in the living room. "Good layout, solid upkeep." I nodded. I'd taken care of it even when I didn't live there. As she walked, I followed a few steps behind, noticing details I'd stopped seeing years ago. The hardwood floors I'd refinished myself. The kitchen counters I'd chosen carefully, saving for months to afford them. The backyard I'd imagined hosting dinners in before that vision quietly slipped away. The house had never been the problem. What struck me most was how different it felt to experience it without the usual undercurrent of obligation. I wasn't there to fix something. I wasn't there to mediate or smooth things over. I was there to observe, to evaluate, to decide. In the guest room, now filled with my parents' belongings, the realtor pointed out the size of the closet and the way the light hit the walls in the afternoon. She didn't comment on how the space had changed or why. She didn't ask whose things were whose. To her, it was just a room. I realized then how much I'd allowed emotion to blur practicality for so long. I'd let guilt turn something tangible into something untouchable. In the kitchen, my mom's craft supplies were spread across the table. Half-finished projects, stacks of paper jars of brushes. It was lived-in, comfortable, settled. The kind of comfort that assumes permanence. "They've made themselves at home," the realtor said gently, not accusatory, just observant. "Yes," I replied, and left it at that. Halfway through the walkthrough, my phone buzzed. A message from my dad asking if I'd seen a piece of mail that might have come earlier. No mention of why I was there. No curiosity. Just logistics. I didn't respond right away. The realtor finished her notes and stepped outside with me to look at the yard. She talked about curb appeal, about how quickly homes like this were moving. She mentioned that the market was strong, that buyers were eager, that timing was on my side. Her words landed with a quiet finality. "This house will do well," she said. "I don't think it'll sit long." I looked back at the structure, the familiar lines of the roof against the sky. For the first time, the idea of it belonging to someone else didn't make my chest tighten. It made something else happen instead. Relief. When the realtor left, my parents returned shortly after carrying groceries, chatting about dinner plans. They barely registered my presence beyond a quick hello. My mom asked if everything was okay, gesturing vaguely toward the rooms. "It's fine," I said. And it was. In a way, it never had been before. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't linger or explain. I let myself leave without guilt, the door closing softly behind me. As I walked to my car, I noticed how light my steps felt, like I wasn't dragging years of expectation behind me anymore. On the drive home, my mind replayed the walkthrough, but not with nostalgia, with clarity. The realtor had seen potential where my family had seen security. She'd seen value where they'd assumed entitlement. And I'd finally seen the difference. That evening, the realtor called to follow up. She confirmed her assessment mentioned interest she anticipated, outlined the next steps, listing photos, pricing strategy, timeline. I listened, asking questions where it mattered, staying present. When she asked if I was ready to move forward, my answer came without hesitation. Yes. After the call, I sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment, letting the day settle. My phone buzzed again, this time with a group message. Jessica had sent another photo of the BMW parked at a scenic overlook. She'd captioned it with something about freedom, about finally feeling ahead in life. I read it without the familiar sting. They were all so focused on what was shiny and new, on what felt good in the moment. They didn't notice how easily I'd slipped out of the background role I'd played for so long. And that was the point. Later that night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the calm expression looking back at me. Not numb, not angry, just resolved. The house no longer felt like a symbol of sacrifice. It felt like something I'd carried as far as I needed to. Something ready to be passed on, not out of spite, but out of honesty. When I lay down, the thought that lingered wasn't fear of what would happen when they found out. It was certainty about why I was doing this. I didn't owe them a conversation. I owed myself an ending. And as I drifted toward sleep, one thing was clear in a way it had never been before. Once you stop seeing a place through guilt, you finally see it for what it is. And once you see it clearly, letting go isn't loss. It's release. The listing went live on a Tuesday morning quietly without ceremony, and I almost missed the notification when it came in. I was at my desk halfway through an email when my phone buzzed. One short message from the realtor. "It's live." I stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, then locked my phone and finished the sentence I was typing. The world didn't pause. No alarms went off. Nothing dramatic happened. But something had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Later that evening, I pulled up the listing on my laptop. The photos were crisp and bright, the rooms staged to highlight space and light rather than memory. The description was factual, efficient. 3 bedrooms, solid structure, desirable neighborhood. No mention of family history. No trace of me. Seeing the house presented that way did something unexpected. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like clarity. Within an hour, the realtor texted again. First inquiry already, then another. By the end of the night, she let me know there were multiple requests for showings scheduled. I didn't interfere. I didn't hover. I told her to handle everything. For the first time, I wasn't managing the narrative. I was letting reality do that for me. While interest in the house picked up speed, my family remained blissfully unaware. My parents were busy with their routines, their comfort uninterrupted. Jessica, meanwhile, was fully immersed in the novelty of her new car. She sent pictures from gas stations, from parking garages, from random streets she'd apparently driven down just to feel the engine hum beneath her. Every photo carried the same unspoken message. Look what I have. Not once did anyone ask how I was doing. Not once did the subject of money come up. The charge on my card existed in a separate universe, one they clearly assumed I'd resolved internally the way I always did. That assumption made everything easier. The first offer came 2 days later. The realtor called me in the early afternoon, her voice measured and professional. "It's a strong one," she said. "Cash buyer, flexible timeline." I listened, asked a few clarifying questions, then told her to hold it while we waited to see what else came in. More did. By the end of the week, there were multiple offers on the table. Some higher, some lower, some with conditions, some clean and straightforward. The market was doing exactly what she'd predicted. I found myself strangely detached from the numbers. Not because they didn't matter, but because the decision had stopped being emotional. This wasn't about squeezing out the last possible dollar or making a statement. It was about certainty. One evening after work, I sat on my couch with my laptop open, reviewing the details. The house felt less like a symbol now, and more like a turning point already in motion. Each offer represented an ending I'd delayed for years. I gave myself one moment to reconsider. Just one. I imagined calling my parents, explaining everything, bracing for the fallout before it arrived. I imagined the tears, the confusion, the way my mom would frame it as betrayal. I imagined my dad's disappointment, heavy and bewildered. I imagined Jessica's outrage, sharp and incredulous. Then I imagined doing nothing, letting things continue as they were, absorbing the BMW charge quietly, paying the bills, staying in the role that required the least disruption. The contrast was immediate and stark. Stopping now wouldn't make me kind. It would make me complicit. The realtor called again the next morning. "There's one offer I think you should seriously consider," she said. "It's not the highest, but it's clean. Quick close, no contingencies." I knew what she was really saying. This one wouldn't drag out. This one wouldn't invite complications. This one would end things cleanly. "Send me the details," I said. As I read through them, the timing jumped out at me. The proposed closing date aligned neatly with my family's schedule. They had plans, distractions, assumptions working in my favor. Not because I'd engineered it that way, but because I'd finally stopped adjusting my life around theirs. The clock wasn't just ticking anymore. It was visible. That night, my phone stayed quiet. No calls, no urgent messages, no sense that anyone was checking in. The silence that once would have felt like abandonment now felt like confirmation. I went to bed early, not out of exhaustion, but out of calm. The kind that comes when a decision has already been made internally, even if it hasn't been finalized on paper yet. The next day, I took a walk during my lunch break, letting the crisp air clear my head. I thought about how often I'd waited for permission to choose myself. How many opportunities I'd deferred because the timing never felt right for everyone else. Timing, I realized, never feels right when you're the one expected to sacrifice. When I got back to my desk, there was an email from the realtor summarizing the current offers and asking how I wanted to proceed. I didn't respond immediately. I finished my workday. I packed up my bag. I drove home. I wanted to answer from a place of steadiness, not impulse. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I'd opened the folder with the house documents days earlier. The space felt familiar, grounded. I reviewed the offer one more time, reading every line carefully. Then I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the table. They thought nothing could change. That was the mistake. I picked up my phone and typed a short message to the realtor. Let's move forward with this one. When I hit send, there was no rush of adrenaline, no dramatic release, just a quiet understanding that what came next would unfold whether anyone was ready for it or not. I stood up, washed my coffee mug, and looked out the window as the evening light faded. Somewhere across town, my parents were settling into the house they believed was secure. Somewhere else, Jessica was probably still finding excuses to drive, still enjoying the thrill of something new. They were all moving forward under the assumption that the ground beneath them was solid, and I was finally letting it shift. The realtor's call came the next morning while I was pouring coffee, and I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to feel how steady my hands were. They've confirmed, she said. Cash, short close, no contingencies. If you're comfortable, we can accept today. I looked at the coffee swirling in my mug, the steam fogging the window above the sink. Comfortable wasn't the word. Certain was. This isn't the highest number, I said mostly to myself. It's the cleanest exit, she replied as if she'd been reading my mind. That was exactly it. I didn't want drama. I didn't want delays. I wanted a door that closed without sticking. Send it over, I said. The documents arrived within minutes. Clean lines, clear terms. No surprises tucked into fine print. I read everything slowly, the way I'd learned to do after years of being the one responsible for consequences. The offer didn't promise miracles. It promised certainty. I signed. There was no one in the room to witness it. No applause, no ceremony. Just my name at the bottom of a page and the soft click of a digital confirmation. Once I hit submit, I sat back in my chair and let the moment land. Not triumph, not relief. Wait, the kind that comes with finality. We set the closing date that afternoon. The timeline locked into place with a precision that felt almost eerie. Everything aligned neatly, not because I'd orchestrated it that way, but because I'd stopped rearranging myself around everyone else's plans. By the time I hung up, escrow was open and the sale was real. I didn't call my parents. I didn't send a message to prepare them. In the past, I would have rushed to soften the impact to manage the emotional fallout before it even arrived. This time I didn't. Silence wasn't secrecy. It was protection. The money began to feel real in small ways. Notifications, confirmations, emails that used words like pending and verified, numbers that had always felt abstract suddenly carried weight and direction. I went about my days normally. Work, groceries, laundry, conversations that had nothing to do with the house or the car or my family. The contrast was surreal. While something irreversible moved forward in the background, my life stayed calm and ordinary. My parents continued to act as if nothing had changed. My mom called once to ask about a package that hadn't arrived yet. My dad sent a message about the weather forecast, worried about the roof during an upcoming storm. Jessica posted another photo with the BMW this time, at a car wash, soap suds glistening under the lights. I watched it all without engaging. Days passed, then a week. The realtor kept me updated, her messages brief and professional. Everything on track. Title search complete. No issues. Closing confirmed. I found myself waiting for nerves that never came. I thought about how often fear had driven my decisions before how many times I'd confused anxiety with responsibility. This felt different. Calm didn't mean careless. It meant resolved. One night, lying in bed, I allowed myself to imagine the moment they'd find out. Not in detail, just the general shape of it. The confusion, the disbelief, the scramble to understand what had happened without me explaining it first. I didn't rehearse speeches or defenses. I didn't fantasize about confrontation. I understood something I hadn't before. I didn't need to be present for their realization to be valid. The night before closing, the realtor sent one final message. Tomorrow morning. All set. I replied with a simple thank you and put my phone down. I slept deeply without interruption, without dreams. The next morning, I went to work like any other day. I answered emails, attended meetings, took notes. The hours passed quietly, deliberately, like the ticking of a clock that had already decided its destination. Sometime after lunch, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, expecting a notification from the realtor. Instead, it was a missed call from my dad. I didn't answer. A minute later, another call, then another. Messages followed, stacking up in quick succession. Short at first, confused, then sharper, urgent. I watched the notifications accumulate without opening them. I knew what they meant without needing to read a word. By the time I left the office, there were more missed calls than I could count. My phone felt heavier in my hand, not because of guilt, but because the moment had arrived exactly as the timeline predicted. At home, I set my bag down and finally checked the realtor's message. Closed. Funds released. Congratulations. I sat on the couch and let that sink in. Whatever happened next was no longer hypothetical. It wasn't dependent on my tone or timing. The decision had moved beyond me. I listened to a few voicemails, not all of them. My dad's voice first strained and confused. He kept saying there must be a mistake. My mom's next, sharper than breaking. Jessica's was last high-pitched and furious, demanding to know what I'd done. They still thought I could fix it. I deleted the rest without listening. I sent one message, just one. It was brief, factual, unemotional. I own the house, I sold it. You lived there for free. I'm done. Then I blocked the numbers. The silence that followed was different from any I'd known before. It wasn't hollow. It wasn't tense. It was full. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the city settle into evening. Somewhere, my family was scrambling to understand a reality they'd never prepared for. Somewhere else, Jessica was realizing that the car she loved didn't come with a safety net attached. And I was here, steady breathing, no longer carrying a story that was never mine to hold. By the time they noticed, it didn't matter. The offer I accepted had done what words never could. It ended the pattern. The day began like any other, and that was the strangest part. I woke up early, made coffee, checked the weather, answered a few emails before work. The quiet felt intentional, like the calm before something that had already decided to happen, whether I was ready or not. I didn't feel dread. I felt prepared. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed for the first time. Dad. I watched it ring until it stopped, set the phone face down, took a breath. A minute later, it buzzed again, then again. Then a text followed. Call me. Something's wrong with the house. I didn't respond. At work, I sat through a meeting while my phone vibrated steadily against the table. I kept my hands folded in my lap, eyes forward, listening to a presentation I barely registered. The buzzing stopped, then started again, relentless now. By the time the meeting ended, there were 12 missed calls. I stepped into the hallway and checked the screen. My mom had joined in. Then Jessica. Numbers stacked up so fast they blurred together. Calls, texts, voicemails. Panic rising in real time. I didn't answer. Around noon, the messages shifted tone. Confusion gave way to accusation. What did you do? There are strangers here. They say they own the house. Call us right now. I felt my pulse quicken, but not with fear, with recognition. This was the moment they'd never imagined. The one where the world didn't bend back into place because I showed up. At 1 o'clock, I listened to the first voicemail. My mom's voice came through tight and brittle. She kept repeating that there had to be a mistake, that someone was confused, that the police were here and they didn't understand why. She said my name like a question, like it could still fix everything. The next voicemail was my dad. His voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. Less certain. He said they'd been told to leave. He asked where they were supposed to go. Jessica's message followed, sharp and furious. She accused me of betrayal, of ruining everything, of going too far. She said I had no right. I let the phone drop back onto my desk. They still thought this was a conversation. I went back to my office and closed the door. The quiet inside that room felt sealed, protected. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I opened my laptop and finished the work I needed to do. When the day ended, I packed up and left like nothing unusual had happened. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. 30 missed calls now, more messages than I could read without scrolling. I drove home without turning on the radio. When I walked into my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and set my bag down. The silence greeted me like an old friend. I sat on the couch and finally allowed myself to open the last message that had come in. Where are we supposed to go? That was the first time I felt something twist in my chest. Not guilt, not regret, just the weight of finality. I typed one message, short, clear, no room for interpretation. I own the house. I sold it. You lived there for free. I'm not responsible anymore. I stared at the screen for a second before sending it. Then I blocked the numbers. All of them. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. No more buzzing. No more interruptions. Just me sitting there breathing. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, traffic moved steadily. People crossed the street carrying groceries, talking on phones, living lives untouched by the moment that had just reshaped mine. I thought about my parents arriving home confused and indignant, expecting the familiar comfort of keys and routine. I imagined the shock when the lock didn't work, the disbelief when strangers answered the door, the realization that authority had shifted not because of cruelty but because of law. For the first time, they were powerless in a situation they hadn't planned for. And for the first time, I wasn't the one absorbing the impact. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of me. I unblocked my voicemail long enough to listen to one more message. Just one. My dad again. Quieter now. He said he didn't understand how this had happened. He said they'd never thought I would do something like this. He asked me to call back so we could talk it through like a family. I deleted the message without responding. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was finished. I made dinner slowly, deliberately savoring the normalcy of it. As I ate, my phone stayed silent. The chaos had moved elsewhere where it belonged. I didn't need to be present for it anymore. That night, as I washed the dishes, I thought about all the times I'd been told I was strong, all the times my strength had been used as justification for taking more from me. Strength, I realized, isn't how much you can carry. It's knowing when to put something down. When I went to bed, I didn't replay their voices in my head. I didn't imagine alternative outcomes. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes after a truth has been fully accepted. They would keep calling, I knew. They would keep looking for a way back into the pattern that had sustained them for so long. But I wouldn't keep answering. The house was gone, and with it the role I'd been forced into my entire life. What happened next was no longer my responsibility. The days after I blocked them were quieter than I expected, not peaceful at first. Just still, like the moment after a loud noise stops and your ears haven't caught up yet. I kept waiting for the rush of panic, the instinct to reach for my phone and smooth things over. That instinct had lived in me for so long it felt almost physical, like a muscle memory. But the phone stayed silent. I went to work. I cooked simple meals. I slept through the night. Nothing dramatic filled the space they'd left behind, and that more than anything told me how much of my energy they'd been consuming without me noticing. A few days later, information started reaching me indirectly, the way it always does when you step out of a family system that depends on you. A distant aunt left a voicemail, careful with her words, asking if everything was all right. A mutual family friend sent a short message saying she'd heard things were complicated and hoped we could all work it out. I didn't respond to either. I didn't need updates to know what was happening. I could imagine it clearly enough. My parents scrambling for a place to stay, shocked not just by the loss of the house, but by the loss of certainty. They'd lived for years believing the ground beneath them was solid because I was holding it up. Now they were learning what it felt like when that support disappeared. A week passed. Then another. The silence from my end held, and slowly the shape of the fallout became clearer. I learned through someone else that my parents had been staying at a motel on the edge of town, the kind they'd always criticized as beneath them. The credit card they usually used for emergencies had been declined, which would have been almost funny if it weren't so predictable. They'd never needed a backup plan before. Jessica, for the first time in her life, was under pressure she couldn't charm her way out of. She reached out to me from an unfamiliar number late one evening. I recognized the tone immediately, even before I realized who it was. "Can we talk? Please? This is getting really bad." I stared at the message for a long time. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was a familiar pull, the urge to step in to fix, to take responsibility for everyone's discomfort just to make the noise stop. That urge scared me more than anything else. I didn't reply. The next message came an hour later, shorter this time. "Mom and Dad are blaming each other. They're fighting constantly. I can't deal with this." I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there staring at the sink while the old guilt tried to reassert itself. This was the moment I would have caved before. The moment where being the strong one meant sacrificing myself to keep the family from imploding. But something was different now. Their chaos wasn't new. It was just no longer buffered by me. The following days confirmed it. More messages from new numbers. Some from Jessica. One from my dad, shorter and more subdued than before. He didn't accuse. He asked if we could meet just to talk, just to figure things out together. Together had always meant on my terms at my expense. I didn't answer. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative shifted once I stopped responding. At first they were confused, then angry, then desperate. And finally something else crept in. Responsibility. Without me there to absorb the consequences, they had no choice but to face each other. My parents, who had leaned on me instead of planning for their future, now had to confront the reality of their finances. Jessica, who had always been shielded, was suddenly the closest option they had left. Through another relative, I heard that my parents had moved in with her temporarily. The arrangement was already strained. Jessica's apartment was small. The boundaries she'd never needed before now felt suffocating. She was discovering piece by piece what it meant to be the safety net. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt something quieter. A confirmation. This was what balance looked like when it finally arrived. One evening as I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed again. Another unfamiliar number. This time it was Jessica calling. I watched it ring until it stopped, then checked the voicemail out of curiosity more than anything else. Her voice sounded tired. Not dramatic, not entitled, just worn down. I didn't get it before she said. I really didn't. Living with them like this, it's a lot. They expect everything. Nothing I do is enough. I didn't realize this is what it was like for you. I sat down slowly, the weight of her words settling in a place I hadn't expected. "I'm not calling to fight," she continued. "I know you're not going to come fix this. I needed you to know I see it now." She hung up without asking for anything. I didn't call her back. Not because I didn't care, but because understanding didn't undo years of damage. And because this too was something she needed to sit with on her own. As the weeks passed, my life began to recenter itself in ways I hadn't anticipated. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I made plans without considering how they might affect anyone else. I spent money on myself without rehearsing explanations in my head. I noticed how much lighter my body felt, how much quieter my mind was. The house stopped coming up in conversations. When my parents were mentioned at all, it was in the past tense, framed as something that had happened, not something waiting to be resolved. That more than anything felt like closure. One afternoon, months later, I was sitting on my couch reading when I realized I hadn't thought about the BMW in days. Not with anger, not with disbelief, not at all. The symbol that had once represented everything wrong with my family dynamic had lost its power. That's when it hit me. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology. Not for understanding. Not for permission. The safety net I'd been my entire life was gone, and the world hadn't ended. It had adjusted. They were learning painfully and unevenly what I'd known all along, that nothing stays afloat without someone holding it up. And that when the wrong person carries that weight for too long, everyone suffers. I had stopped being the answer to every problem, and in doing so, I had finally given myself the space to exist as something else entirely. That wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of my role in theirs. A year passed before I realized how far away that life had drifted. Not because something dramatic marked the anniversary. There was no date circled on my calendar, no sudden rush of memories. It happened quietly one ordinary morning when I caught myself laughing at something small and realized my chest didn't tighten afterward. There was no guilt chasing the joy, no voice in my head reminding me that someone else might need me more. I was finally living without bracing for impact. By then, my life looked different in ways that would have shocked the version of me who used to count every dollar and every emotional favor. I had moved to a new apartment, one with light pouring in through wide windows and enough space to breathe. I'd changed jobs not because I was forced to, but because I wanted something that felt like growth instead of endurance. People at work asked about my family sometimes the way they always do when conversations drift toward holidays or childhood memories. I learned to answer honestly without oversharing. We're not close, I'd say, and that was enough. I didn't owe anyone the full story anymore. Occasionally, information still filtered back to me. Not in real time, not urgently, just fragments. My parents had downsized again. My dad's health had declined more than he liked to admit. My mom had taken a part-time job she complained endlessly about. Jessica had moved across the state chasing a fresh start that looked suspiciously like escape. None of it pulled at me the way it once would have. That surprised me the most. I'd expected forgiveness to be loud or emotional or ceremonial. I thought it would feel like a decision I made one day and stuck to with effort. Instead, it arrived slowly disguised as indifference. Not coldness, not bitterness, just the absence of the old ache. I didn't forgive them because they apologized. They never really did. I forgave them because I stopped needing them to be different for me to move on. One evening I found an old box while unpacking books onto a shelf. Inside were photographs I hadn't looked at in years. Birthdays where my smile looked practiced. Holidays where I stood slightly apart from the rest of the frame. A picture of me in front of the house I'd sold, arm around my parents, looking proud in a way that now felt painfully naive. I sat on the floor and looked at those photos for a long time. I didn't hate that version of myself. I felt compassion for her. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. She believed love meant sacrifice without limits. She thought endurance was the same thing as loyalty. No one had taught her otherwise. I slid the photos back into the box and closed the lid gently. Some things belong to the past, even if they shaped you. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I knew who it was before I opened it. It was my mother. The message was long, meandering, familiar. She wrote about how hard things had been, about how families make mistakes, about how time was precious and shouldn't be wasted on grudges. She said she hoped I was well. She said she missed me. I read it once, then again, and then I did something that would have been impossible for me a year earlier. I put the phone down without replying, not because I wanted to punish her, not because I felt superior, but because responding would have reopened a door I had finally learned to keep closed. Silence, I'd learned, can be an answer, a complete one. I went out onto my balcony and watched the city lights come on one by one. Somewhere people were arguing. Somewhere someone was being celebrated. Somewhere another family was replaying patterns they didn't know how to break yet. And here I was, standing in the quiet I'd built for myself, feeling steady. I didn't get everything I wanted out of this story. There was no heartfelt apology, no public acknowledgement, no moment where everyone suddenly understood how much they'd hurt me. What I got instead was something better. Freedom. Freedom from explaining myself. Freedom from carrying guilt that was never mine. Freedom from being the safety net for people who never learned how to stand on their own. Selling the house wasn't about revenge. The credit card charge wasn't even the real breaking point. Those were just the moments where the truth finally became undeniable. The real shift happened when I chose myself without waiting for permission. If you've stayed with me this long, maybe part of you recognizes that feeling. Maybe you've been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who always absorbs the impact so everyone else can stay comfortable. If that's you, I want you to know something. You're allowed to stop. You're allowed to set boundaries that disappoint people. You're allowed to choose peace over approval, and you don't have to wait for a crisis to do it. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from or what part of this hit closest to home. And if you want to stay for more stories about quiet revenge family drama and finding your strength when the tables finally turn, make sure you're subscribed. Sometimes the most powerful endings aren't loud. They're the ones where you finally walk away and don't look back.